Our first speaker is very inspiring. Hannah Evans is amazing, and I'm so glad she was able to come up to speak for us. She's been interested in population stems from her experience working and volunteering throughout Central America, where she was able to see firsthand the importance of integrated, community-based, and comprehensive development strategies. She has her BA in environmental policies and political science and a master's in political ecology from San Diego State University. Her thesis research focused on sustainable labeling and ethical consumption in the U.S. and Nicaragua, as she's an adjunct professor also at SDSU. And Hannah has taught classes on gender, science, and technology. She specializes in bringing complex conceptual issues down to earth for others concerned about protecting the environment and improving well-being. Please help me welcome, from Population Connection, Hannah Evans.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Happy Earth Day. This is my second time being at Berkeley Earth Day, and I'm just so excited to be here. Thank you so much for Hope for organizing this event. I'm really excited. As she said, my name is Hannah, and I work for Population Connection. Have any of you heard of Population Connection before? Oh, nice, one. So Population Connection is a U.S.-based nonprofit that focuses in increasing U.S. aid for family planning programs internationally. And in addition to a lot of the advocacy work we do, we also do a ton of education and outreach just about the connections between rapid population growth and poverty, and what environmental sustainability means within the context of rapid population growth. So today I'm just going to be kind of talking about sort of the conceptual underpinnings of our organization's mission, why population is important to talk about, why rapid population growth is a big issue with regards to environmental sustainability, and then what we can do to sort of offset that. We'll talk at the end about one of our policies that we're working really adamantly against, called the Global Gag Rule. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. Good. And then we'll talk about different ways to get involved. Okay, so as I was kind of outlining before, Population Connection focuses on the links between rapid population growth, access to comprehensive health care, and environmental sustainability. As an environmental organization, we're very much interested in understanding the different ways that humans impact the environment. And as a human rights-based organization, we're very much focused in understanding the root causes of population growth, specifically within the context of reproductive autonomy. We know that when women have access to the full spectrum of reproductive care, and when women have access to resources like education and economic opportunity, that fertility rates naturally drop. More women go to school, more women sort of harness gainful employment. Women and children and societies advance overall, and the environment ultimately is healthier in terms of environmental limitations. And so as an organization, one of our primary focuses is population growth. And there are several different reasons for this. And the first is the fairly obvious point that you can probably conclude by just looking at this graph, which is that the human population has grown substantially and exponentially over the past 200 years. So in fact, until about 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people. And at that point, the death rates began to fall significantly and population began to grow drastically. Does anyone know exactly what happened 200 years ago to make that happen? The plague. The Industrial Revolution, good. So modern innovations in things like public health, sanitation, technology, of course agriculture, all contributed to a situation where we now have, in which we add 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. So remember, until 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people, and now we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years, which is just unprecedented in terms of growth. That means that the planet adds about 83 million people to the planet each year at a rate of nearly 250,000 people per day, or 157 people per minute. And if we take a quick look at the UN's projections for the future populations into 2100, you can see that there are several different projections. So the UN's constant fertility, which is shown in blue, can you guys see the blue? That actually assumes that that fertility rates will remain the exact same as they are now. So as you can see, that will result in us having 26 billion people on the planet by the year 2100, which is very disconcerting, but also highly unlikely, luckily. Likely where we're going to end up is at the medium variant at about 11.2 billion people by the end of the century, but that's going to depend very heavily on adaptations and innovations in family planning and access to healthcare more broadly. And just to give you some context, the UN's low variant assumes that every woman in the medium variant would have half a child fewer than she has now. So that would actually result in the world having 200 million fewer people on the planet than we have today, which just goes to show you what a small sort of innovation can make in terms of a big change, affecting big change. Excuse me. So we're talking about how 26 billion people on the planet would be really awful and, why population growth needs to stop. Well, what does that actually mean, right? Well, for environmentalists, the rate of growth is actually very, very concerning for many different reasons, and you guys are probably all familiar with all of them. But it's concerning in many ways, but partly because we understand that rapid population growth, or population growth in general, correlates very linearly with things like resource use, consumption, and environmental degradation in many cases. And in a macro context, this is proven to be very true. So if we look historically, we can see that fossil fuel production has increased in almost lockstep with population growth. And there are many different graphs that you can actually overlay on top of population growth that would give you the same sort of projections, things like species extinction, habitat destruction, resource use, water use, so on and so forth. And many of the links between population and the environment are very well known, especially in this crowd, right? So worldwide, we affect the planet in many different ways. We destroy wildlife habitats, causing species to go extinct. We change the chemistry of the oceans. We use resources at unsustainable rates. And as we're all well aware, we contribute to climate change. And population pressures, as we'll get into later, actually contribute to a variety of social issues as well, including increases in infant mortality and maternal deaths, less access to education overall, less access to employment, the sort of institutionalization of patriarchal structures, and so on. And so what we want to try to highlight here also in a sort of global context is that population growth is not happening evenly everywhere. There are many different places on the planet actually where fertility rates are at or below replacement level. Does anybody know what replacement rate fertility is? Replacement level? 2.5, that's close. 2.1, yep. Who said that? You did? Yep, exactly, 2.1. So it's just replacement level fertility is just replacing the two parents that you have. So it's 2 or 2.1, and eventually what it means is that population will stabilize over time instead of increase. So there are many different places on the planet that you can see. Oh gosh, this always gets really distorted in terms of color. But there are many different places on the planet that are at or below replacement level fertility, right? And what you can look at and see by looking at this map is that the majority of population growth is taking place in the most marginalized places on Earth, right? So most of Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Asia, and parts of Latin America. And here we need to make a very important distinction, right? Because many have made the mistake of linking rapid population growth with environmental degradation in a very linear way. And of course, this is a massive and very dangerous oversimplification. That sort of logic would somehow conclude that the poorest populations are actually contributing the most to environmental degradation and climate change, and of course, that's not the case. In fact, things like CO2 emissions actually have much more to do with the onset and perpetuation of climate change than population does alone, right? So for example, the United States represents 5% of the world's population, but consumes 25% of the Earth's resources and fossil fuels. And if we look at that same information aggregated in a global context, it's clear that for the most part, CO2 emissions are highest in the wealthiest countries, right? And this makes sense because things like consumption patterns run in accordance with things like per capita income, total GDP, governmental structure, and so on. And for this reason, and many others, population studies as they relate to the environment have sort of remained contentious. And yes, there are some really very, very, very scary racist, classist, extremist histories related to the very idea that there are too many people on the planet. And it's very important to acknowledge this and understand this, and even emphasize it whenever we're talking about population and the environment. But population is important. Talking about population and family planning and environmental conservation is not inherently coercive. And of course, as an organization focused in human rights, we are in no way advocating for draconian measures to control the population or certain populations or anything like that. But the fact is, greater people on the planet does cause more strain on the environment. Each person consumes resources and causes emissions throughout their lifetime, albeit at varying degrees. And so what we want to try to talk about today is that there are different ways to talk about population within a human rights framework. And the fact that more people on the planet is causing environmental degradation should be concerning to us, even from a human rights perspective. And so to help clarify this, let's take a look at some of the ways that demography is set to influence the planet. So if we take a look at the current state of the world, you might sort of assume, based off of your education or background, that there's two worlds, a developing and a developed world. And this is actually an oversimplification. Hans Rosling has done a lot of work on demography, and he was a famous statistician who has sort of reconceptualized the world and categorized it into 4 different levels based off of relative population and income. And if you take a look at this slide, you can see that the majority of the world's population is actually in levels 2 and 3. So making anywhere from $2 to $8 a day or $8 to $32 a day. And that represents about 5 billion people. And these sort of economies represent low income or emerging economies. And historically, innovations in healthcare and advancements in technology and economic opportunity have helped increase the livelihoods and standards of living for these sort of emerging economies. And this is exactly what's projected to happen in the next 50 to 100 years. So in fact, many low and middle income economies are expected to increase their access to opportunity significantly and increase their standards of living by 2050 and certainly by the year 2100. So just for example, think about all of the massive innovations that China has made in the past 50 years alone. So at 1.4 billion people, this once developing country is on par to reach the same sort of socioeconomic status and access that the places with the highest and most socioeconomically developed places are by 2050. And by the way, this is a really, really great thing. Everyone deserves a better standard of living. Everybody deserves a better standard, the ability to consume resources and increase their livelihoods and access resources at rates that will allow them to live a comfortable life. Everybody deserves this. And increased economic opportunity ultimately means lower fertility rates overall. It means increased access to education. It means increased access to economic opportunity. These are all really, really great things. But what will that mean then for global environmental degradation that's set forth by things like consumption patterns, that's set forth by things like resource use and waste production and habitat destruction? And additionally, what about the poorest 2 billion people on the planet, level 1, for which fertility rates remain the highest? The poorest 2 billion people on the planet have not made the same or experienced the same economic or social advancements that levels 2 and 3 have. And this is largely to do with the fact that they have no access to resources at all. At 1 billion people, this population is making less than $2 a day, so they're barely scraping by. So here, infant mortality and maternal death rates are very high, while education rates, economic opportunity, and access to healthcare are very low. And this is one place where population pressures really do come into play because it is in these regions that the population growth is actually happening the fastest. So in upcoming decades, this population of 1 billion people will increase to 3 and then 4 billion people. This is definitely going to happen. But population growth will only stabilize and set to decline if people have access to resources and if people have access to things like family planning. As we've talked about before, the world's population is set to grow to 9 billion people by 2050, and it is only by increasing the livelihoods and standards of living of the world's poor will we be able to actually check population growth. And so the fact is, there's a direct correlation between high fertility rates and poverty. Places considered marginalized without access to vital resources such as clean water, healthcare, education, economic opportunity, and so on, tend also to have the highest fertility rates and the highest unmet need for contraception. And high fertility can pose a lot of costly burdens, especially on developing regions. It may impede economic opportunities for growth, increase health risks for women and children, and erode quality of life by reducing access to things like education, nutrition, employment, and scarce resources such as potable water. And so from both human rights and environmental perspectives, population growth is an extremely important issue, particularly within the context of things like climate change. So for one, the very same places that experience high fertility and low economic status are also the most at risk with regards to climate change. They're the most vulnerable populations, despite the fact that they actually contribute the least to climate change in terms of CO2 emissions. And this heightened vulnerability is largely reflective of the fact that people in lower socioeconomic statuses oftentimes don't have things like savings. They're very much sort of subject to their natural environments, oftentimes, participating in subsistence-based agriculture, and they oftentimes have limited alternative economic employment opportunities. So, for example, Bangladesh contributes a fraction of CO2 emissions in comparison to the United States, so 0.4 metric tons to R17, but is projected to suffer major damage from sea level rise. So it's projected that a 3-foot rise in sea level would submerge 20% of the country and displace over 30 million people by the end of the century. And as you can see just by looking at this map, the majority of the country is at a very high risk of flooding. Bangladesh, interestingly, from a population perspective, is considered a very prominent emerging economy and is expected to grow significantly in upcoming years. So the country, therefore, is experiencing large-scale urbanization, which increases threats posed by climate change relative to things like infrastructure, resource use, population pressures, and so on. Climate change is also set to induce large-scale in-country migrations. So some estimates predict that more than 143 million people will be forced to migrate as a direct result of crop failure, water scarcity, and sea level rise. And much of the coming migration will shift populations from rural to urban areas and will take place in places like sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, which are 3 places that represent 55% of the world's developing world. The effects of climate change have also already begun to affect social structures in many different places throughout the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, where we do a lot of our research. So here, the incidence of child marriage is increasing as a direct result of climate change-induced agricultural devastation. So unprecedented floods and droughts have made chronic poverty even worse, and actually increases the likelihood of child marriage amongst young girls whose families have lost the ability to provide for them. And for example, in Malawi, on average in a given year, 4 or 5 million girls are at risk of marrying before the age of 18. And by the way, there are many different reasons for this. But new studies are coming out linking the effects of climate change and are arguing that out of the 4 to 5 million girls, each year, 1.5 of them are at risk of marrying as a direct consequence of climate change-related issues. And of course, child marriage is a massive humanitarian crisis. It's really difficult to even conceptualize or think about from a human rights perspective, but even from an economic standpoint as well, in terms of sort of developing and transcending poverty, the opportunity costs lost through girls marrying at younger ages is very, very significant. Recent estimates for 12 countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa, which accounts for half of the African's population, suggests that through its impact on girls' education, child marriage is costing these countries about $63 billion in earnings and human capital wealth. Child marriage, of course, also leads to things like high fertility and ultimately population growth. And in these particular socioeconomic contexts, high fertility and rapid population growth puts lots of strains on the environment and leads to lower standards of living, ultimately. So in recognition of all of these different interconnected issues, we work to institutionalize family planning. We want to increase access to family planning worldwide, especially in regions that have high fertility and low access to contraceptives. So really briefly, family planning ultimately reduces infant mortality rates, slows population growth, reduces pressures on the environment, specifically within the context of access to resources. It increases rates of education whenever women are able to have children at older ages. They are able to go to school longer. It reduces poverty rates and lowers maternal mortality rates overall. Family planning, just loosely defined, enables people to make informed decisions about their sexual and reproductive health. So loosely defined, family planning represents the education and access necessary for women and families to plan the timing and spacing of their births, which ultimately yields a multitude of social, economic, and environmental benefits. So much so that it's vitally connected to a majority of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. So from an environmental perspective, family planning is being recognized internationally as a critical human rights-based and cost-effective approach to climate change adaptation and resilience building. And of course, the ability for countries to effectively and equitably respond to climate change is going to require very comprehensive solutions and very sort of complex mitigation and adaptation strategies. And it's ultimately predicated on a greater understanding of the connections between interrelated development strategies. And family planning, through its social and economic and environmental benefits, represents one of these interconnected strategies. So research actually shows that eliminating the unmet need for family planning has substantial implications for slowing climate change by providing 16 to 29% of the needed emissions reductions by 2050. It also greatly reduces the need for food production, and so on. And so by the end of the century, the effective slower population growth could reduce total emissions from fossil fuels by 37 to 41%, which is very substantial. Paul Hawken, who's the author of Drawdown, who's actually made all of these estimates, argues that investments in family planning and girls' education combined could actually reduce total emissions by 121 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2050, which is actually more than on and offshore wind power combined. Family planning is also extremely cost effective. The emissions averted through investments in family planning are much cheaper in comparison to things like solar and wind power. And additionally, family planning, as we've kind of been talking about before, helps foster stronger economies. Again, the sort of lifetime opportunity cost of adolescent pregnancy in general, which again is a measure of the annual income adolescent girls forgo in their lifetime because they're marrying earlier and having children at younger ages, ranges from 1% of annual gross domestic product in a large country like China to almost 30% of the annual GDP in a smaller country like Uganda. So for example, if adolescent girls in Brazil and India were able to wait until their early 20s to actually start having children, the increased economic opportunity would equal more than $3.5 billion and $7.7 billion respectively. Investments in healthcare, therefore, are very necessary in sort of harnessing the demographic dividends and creating stronger and more resilient economies. And there are many different examples of success stories related to family planning, even in areas that you might not expect, right? So one such example is this country. Does anyone know where this is? Colorado? Nope. International. Peru. That's a good guess. Anyone now know? Yes, very true. Anyone? It's actually smaller than the size of Maryland in terms of a state. Yes, Rwanda. Good. So Rwanda's government has made massive innovations in family planning and community health overall, and has seen really, really great results as a consequence. So in 2000, Rwanda's fertility rate was 6.1, and it actually fell to 4.6 in 2014, and now it's at about 4.2. And in order to do this, Rwanda has just engaged in massive sort of PR campaigns, sort of naturalizing and familiarizing family planning culturally. They also engage in things like community health workers, where they train health workers and sort of disperse them to rural communities that are the most at risk. And they've really done a great job in terms of investments in family planning, and are definitely considered a success story. So another geography quiz. Does anyone want to guess where this might be? Pakistan? No. Oh, Iran. Good. So Iran is another example of a massive success story. Before the Iranian Revolution, Iran had some of the highest fertility rates in the entire world, at about 7 children per woman. And in 1993, Iran passed a national family planning law that actually encouraged women to have fewer children. And they again engaged in massive PR campaigns and sort of strategies that were entirely voluntary, but that sort of naturalized and normalized family planning culturally, and allowed for women to plan the timing and spacing of their births. And as a consequence, their fertility rate has dropped significantly. Right now it's at about 1.66, so well below replacement level. And so that's kind of what we're advocating for overall. And right now there are about 214 million women in developing regions alone who want to prevent pregnancy but are not using modern forms of contraception. So this actually results in around 74 million unintended pregnancies each year. And by the way, while this presentation is clearly focused internationally, I want to also recognize that there's a very, very high need in the United States as well, especially recently. The United States, there's actually 45% of pregnancies here are unintended, so I do want to acknowledge that as well. But internationally, there's about a $5.3 billion funding shortfall for providing full access to reproductive care. The U.S. is the single largest contributor of aid for international family planning programs, and that funding is constantly under severe threat, especially in the past few years, even though the contributions that we do make are well under even 1% of our annual budget. We currently donate about $600 million each year. So if all unmet need for contraception were met in developing regions, there would be approximately a 3/4 decline in unintended pregnancies, from 89 million to 22 million per year. There would be a sharp decline in unplanned births, from 30 million to 7 million per year, and sharp decline in induced abortions, from 48 million to 12 million per year. And the health benefits of preventing unintended pregnancies would also be very significant. So fully meeting the current need for modern contraception would actually result in an estimated 76,000 fewer maternal deaths each year. So currently, as an organization, what we're fighting against is the global gag rule, also known as the Mexico City policy. This is an extremely harmful policy that influences and limits the way that U.S. aid is distributed to global health programs. And just really briefly, the global gag rule just states that any foreign organization will lose its funding when it uses its own money to offer abortion services, to provide information about abortions or to provide referrals, to provide education surrounding abortions, or to advocate to change abortion laws. This policy is not new. It was first introduced in 1984 and is highly partisan, so it's been rescinded, reinstated, depending on who's been in power. However, under Trump's newly expanded version, the funding restrictions actually apply to all global health programs, not just those focused on family planning. So this means that over 16 times the amount of health aid is at stake and affects groups working on things like TB, HIV, malaria, and maternal health as well. So as a consequence of this policy, organizations must choose whether to receive U.S. funding despite being forced to sort of limit the information that they provide and the services that are available to people, or to refuse vital U.S. funding entirely, the latter resulting in massive employment cuts and widespread facility shutdowns. This is obviously extremely devastating for many different reasons, but especially in poor regions, because when facilities shut down, many people lose access to the full range of healthcare in general. Things like access to contraceptives, cervical cancer screenings, HIV and AIDS treatments, and other essential services not related to abortion. And just a few notes about how ironic this policy actually is in terms of its efficacy. First, many health programs in developing regions are now becoming more integrated so that they provide and offer a variety of services, including but also unrelated to abortion. Things like HIV prevention and treatment, prenatal checkups, immunizations, and information or referrals about safe abortion care. They all now take place in one facility. And so the global gag rule makes it so that these NGOs are actually denied any global health funding from the United States because they provide integrated care that includes information or services related to abortion. So even though a small section of their much larger organization deals with abortion, if they receive the funding from the United States, they have to abolish it entirely. The second, which is shown here on the chart, is that there is a broader global trend towards the liberalization of abortion laws, especially in developing regions, which means that there are more countries where access to legal abortion services will now be impeded by the global gag rule. So in many places where abortion is becoming legalized in certain contexts, the global gag rule is now preventing these countries from even accessing or sort of implementing the laws that they are now passing. Kenya, for example, recently liberalized their abortion laws and made it legal to have abortion under certain contexts, but now they lack funding to be able to provide that service because of the United States. Additionally, the global gag rule was designed and passed by lawmakers who were interested in reducing the overall number of abortions worldwide. So therefore, each time it's passed, it's been considered a moral victory for those who aren't, who are in opposition, to abortion. But however, there are several inherent contradictions to this. So the first is the United States never directly funds abortions. It's illegal for us to do so domestically or internationally. We never do it. We usually just give, aid to organizations and then let them use it how they see fit. So the second is that the policy does not actually stop women from seeking an abortion. What it actually does is reduces women's access to high-quality contraceptive services and education surrounding family planning, which then, in turn, increases the probability of having an unintended pregnancy, and it increases the probability of seeking an abortion. This is especially concerning in developing regions because the majority of these abortions are unsafe. More than 22,000 women die every year because of unsafe abortion, and most of these take place in developing regions. So if you can take a look at this graph, you can see that abortions actually spiked as a consequence of the global gag rule whenever it was implemented under George W. Bush. And again, the majority of these abortions are now taking place in very unsafe conditions. So in opposition to this, we are fighting for the HER Act, the Health Empowerment and Rights Act. It is a policy that would permanently repeal the global gag rule, so it would make it impossible for presidents to come in and just sign an executive order, either rescinding it. It would also permanently institutionalize funding for family planning programs internationally and increase that funding as well. So if you're interested in learning more about this, we have an entire field team who's dedicated specifically to rallying college students, especially in swing states, around the idea of advocating your Congress people in favor of the HER Act and in favor of reproductive justice. I'm going to end with a short little video, but we can open it up for questions after that.
Actually, unfortunately, need to wrap it up.
Oh.
Your time is up.
Okay.
How long is the video?
Well, it's 40 seconds.
Oh, that
Okay.
oh, we can do that.
I came to the clinic for family planning because I want to be a responsible girl.
Do you have any children now?
Yeah, I have one, a girl. I have to seek family planning so that my daughter can have the best, not like me.